Hello, Sylvia Johnson here. This is a screencast for my model. It's a diagnostic model in learning environment modeling language for General Chemistry 1004, which is the course I'm going to be teaching next fall, and I'm supposed to be making changes to for Monica Varner's 3 Pillars of Learning intervention. And so what we have here is a diagnostic model of how the course is usually taught. And there's several things that I noticed as I was making the model. And I don't know if it's supposed to be part of assignment 1 or apartment assignment 2, but I'm just going to say them when they come out to me, and then we'll just make sure they get in the right bin, I guess. So anyway, this is the overview. We start here, and the first thing I realized is that the course just goes straight through. It's all the professor's responsibility. This professor gives a lecture, gives a lecture, gives a lecture, gives a quiz, give a lecture, give a lecture, give a lecture, give a quiz, lecture, 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 quiz, then gives a review session and gives a test, and then goes back lecture, lecture, and then that repeats lecture, 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 quiz, lecture, 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 quiz, lecture, 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 quiz, then give a review session, give a test, more lecture, and so on. And it just goes back and forth through here, and the student doesn't have to do a thing. Now, meanwhile, down here, we're supposed to be getting from them 2 hours out of class for every 1 hour in. And as my model shows, there's no connection between these 2 hours and that lecture. And so most of the students, I guess they think they know they're supposed to be doing something, but they have no idea that after the first lecture, they're supposed to go and be busy for 2 hours, and they haven't a clue what they should be doing in those 2 hours after the first class. So we've got all of this 2 hours out of class, 2 hours out of class, 2 hours out of class, matching all of these lecture times, and they're kind of just unused. I mean, a conscientious student might think of something to do, but most of our kids, they're not even aware that this is under here and that this is their responsibility. Then over here, what I showed, which will be useful when we go on to make the new model, is that for all of these different weeks that go by, we can put the learning outcomes, because right now these learning outcomes are just whatever the quiz is over, and they may or may not be linked to what these lectures were about, but it could just be a quiz topic. And it's certainly, these objectives here are not linked to what's going on over here in the lab. The lab is just running separately, and that is also the professor's responsibility. The professor makes sure everything is there, the student presents themselves, and then they have the lab, and then that just repeats for 15 weeks. So this is a pretty bare bones, and I think it shows a couple of things that are a problem. One thing is, in the week when there's a test, we get around the credit hours. We're supposed to give them, here's a cleverness that my department has come up with. They have the 1 hour in class where they're taking the test, and then we give them 2 hours outside of class in that same test period, so they can stay longer if they want to work on a test more than 1 hour. Isn't that clever? And that meets the credit hour requirement. But then that also means that this 1 hour in class is being swapped for this 1 hour in class, and this review session here is optional. So this review session is optional, which means that then these 2 hours outside of class would also be optional, except that it's the night before the exam. So of all the nights that they would study, they probably would finally cram here in these 2 hours of practice before the test that would happen, say, once a month. Then we would have to also say, well, then that would be the 2 hours that would have been after Friday would be stuck over here. So then here they would have, they wouldn't know what to do at all. So there's a lot of time management issues in here, and there's a lot of coordination issues in here. But the gist of it is that they go week 1, and then there's a quiz. Week 2, there's a quiz. Week 3, there's a quiz. And then week 4, there's a review session and a test. Then they go back week 5, week 6, week 7, week 8, there's a review session and a test. And then meanwhile, not really, well, week by week, there's this lab going on, but it's very hard to coordinate the lab. I guess the only thing you could say about the lab is that if your quizzes were on Friday, everybody would have done the lab here between Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, because the same lab is offered 4 times a week, and the 25 students split over the 100 students split 25 at a time over the 4 sections. And then at the end of that, they do that like 14 or 16, 15 weeks. And then here way at the very end, then there's a written exam that they have to take, and there's a practical exam. And this is also very heavily dependent on professor's action, and the student just shows up. And a lot of them really, they don't even know. They just come every week and say, oh, what are we doing this week? Huh, well, that's interesting. And then they stay and do it, and then they leave and they completely forget what it was about, and then the next week they show up and it's another big mystery and they see what that is. So there's very little prep time here. The lab is 3 hours long, and it's only 1 credit. So the 1 hour in lab and the 2 hours out of lab is all taken up in that same 3 hours right there. So that is it. That is the diagnostic model of how General Chemistry 1004 usually goes when most professors teach it. It's very lecture dependent. There's traditional quizzes. There's not very much done about what the students should be doing outside of class. Oh, and then the other thing in here, if we're going to look for what they get, the only place where there's dialogue would be in this review session that they which is optional. So the dialogue is there optional, that they might come to the review session once a month and ask questions. And then the only place to get feedback, right? Here's our evidence. They're going to have quizzes, and then we're going to have tests, but they don't waste any class time giving the tests or quizzes back. And they certainly don't waste any class time going over the quizzes. The quizzes are just set here. You would get your feedback by picking up your quiz and going to a cardboard box outside the professor's office, and the professor may or may not even be in the office when you pick up your paper. So the feedback is just a number on a paper when you pick up your quiz, or over here a number on a paper when you pick up your exam. And that is pretty much, that is the grind. That is how it goes. I have this blown way out so I can point at things, because presumably you'll have the other link where you can go and look at this. This part up here is just giving the different weeks, and this down here is showing practice, and this over here is describing what the student will do. The student is supposed to study outside of class. The student is supposed to go get the papers. This one here, where all the arrows are, is all heavily instructor dependent, and this down here is the lab. And then this lab thing just repeats 16 or 15 times. And then they have, at the end, they have a test. So that's what I have to say about that. And it is gruesome. And it is a real grind. And our kids get through it. And our pre-nurses take it. And a lot of other students that have a chemistry requirement will take it. It's also our GE offering. And so that's why it is up for modification in the 3 pillars process, because it is a GE offering. So I'm going to go back and check the list to see if I covered everything. So here at the end, I have a close-up of what happens weekly. You can see here, these are the weeks. This is the lecture. This would only be a half a lecture on Friday and a quiz. We have to cover as much material as possible. So we want to make sure that even on the quiz day, that there's a lecture time to get more information conveyed. And then this is the part that repeats. This is showing underneath that the student on their own is supposed to know to go and spend 2 hours out of class for every 1 hour in. And then if we move over to here, this shows the examination week with this is considered compensatory time in exchange for the exam. And then, but it's optional review. And maybe a third of the students come to it. The ones who come usually don't need the review, and the ones who need the review can't be bothered. So that's kind of a problem there. And then this shows that the exam period, it's in the evening, so it can extend beyond a 1 hour time. And then you come back and the next morning, right, this would be Tuesday night. Then the next morning, Wednesday morning, there'd be class again. So the custom is usually to give this day before. I would think that you would, if you were up late for a Tuesday night exam, you might give the Wednesday after off. But that's not usually what's done. Besides, everybody's eager to just put this material behind them and go on to the new material. And then since there was a test that week, then on that Friday, there is not an exam. Some professors, when they do this, they will have class on this Monday that will be material that they need to know, but it would be new material that was not appear on this exam, but it would be material they'd be responsible for on the next exam. And then some professors like to give, then instead they would give the off day here on the Friday, and that would be after the test, and they would go over the tests. So that might be some feedback and dialogue when in certain professors, if they do it that way. And then down here you can see I had these, they pick up the results, and that's just kind of out of time as well. They just come when they can to the professor's office, and they're in the hallway on a table will be their papers. And that's it. So I just thought here at the end I would put in a close-up so you could see how that went. And then down here underneath, let's see if I can get the lab. Down here underneath we just have the lab. And the lab is all very much instructor driven as well. There's this little spot in the middle here, and this kind of shows a problem too, that we might make some change, because it's a 3-hour lab, and when you look at really what they do, they might be busy for 60 minutes. Because they're going to have 50 minutes beforehand where they get all the instruction about what they're going to do, and then they go do it, and then afterwards then they have time when they write up the lab report and do the calculations and do that. And so that's not really doing the lab at that point either. So in the 3-hour lab period, it might, I don't know if this is really true for every professor, because it kind of sounds like a problem, but it sort of looks this way here in the model, that they're actually busy maybe for an hour. And then after they work that hour, then they go and they do stuff with their pencil, which would count as practice, and it's actually application of the concept, but it's not necessarily really wet chemistry and lab work. And then they turn that lab in at the end of that day. And then when they come next week at the start, they'll get the prior week's lab back. So they would see it right immediately. And then whatever changes they might have made, they'd have to internalize sort of on the spot, because then they would be there to do the next week's lab. And so whatever mistakes they had made in the prior week's lab that they were going to learn from, they would have had that paper in their hands maybe 10 minutes, and then it's time to go and do the new class. And then at the end of that day, they have to turn in another lab report, which presumably would be better than the one that they just got back. So I could see that that would be a problem also, that the timing of this is very tight. But we just crank them through. They come in, they get the papers. We've got a grader who leaves the papers in a tub, and they pick up their papers, and then they go do the lab, and then they drop off the new paper in the tub, and they just come back next week, and the grader's been through it, and it's there for them. And this just cycles through week after week after week. So that is how the lab goes. And then at the end, we have here, there would be not a pre-lab. There's no pre-lab, but there might be written work. So there'd be and it would be over the whole semester content with a written lab exam. And then after that, then there's usually wet chemistry. They have to go and prepare solutions and label them, based on the calculations that they had done in this part of it. So this kind of I didn't want to do that. This part is not too bad. It's actually one of the better things we do. We have the lab practical set up in a way that they can go and do a lot of different activities and show that they've gained proficiency in using a lot of different kinds of apparatus. So that's the end.